Everyone ignored the stray cat at the deserted shelter until one lonely widower showed up, and the wind howled a lonely tune across the desolate Montana plains, whistling through the broken panes of the old animal shelter's windows. Dust devils danced across the parched earth of the yard, swirling around rusted food bowls and frayed ropes that once held playful pups. The Happy Paws Haven sign, once brightly painted, now hung crookedly, its letters peeling like sunburnt skin. The paint was faded, a faded periwinkle, mirroring the washed-out sky above. The shelter had been a vibrant place once. The air had been filled with the barks of dogs, the meows of cats, the occasional squawk of a rescued parrot named Pete, who had a penchant for mimicking the sound of the old dial-up modem. There was the memory of Barnaby, a three-legged Labrador mix who'd been the unofficial greeter, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the wooden floor of the reception area. There'd been a whole colony of kittens born under the porch one spring, their tiny mews echoing through the building. But that was years ago. Now silence reigned. The kennels were empty, their doors hanging open like slack jaws. The cattery, once a chaotic symphony of purrs and hisses, was eerily quiet, the scent of catnip long faded. The only sounds were the creak of the old building settling, the mournful wind, and the occasional scuttling of a field mouse brave enough to venture out in the daylight. But one creature remained, a ginger cat, his fur the color of a setting sun, lay curled in a tight ball beneath the shelter's porch. He was thin, his ribs visible beneath his matted fur, but his eyes, a startling amber, held a spark of defiance. This was Rusty. He hadn't always been Rusty. He'd had other names in other lives, perhaps. But those names were lost to the wind, like the whispers of the animals who had once shared this space. His days followed a predictable, desolate pattern. He'd wake with the sunrise, stretch stiffly, and then begin his patrol. He'd stalk the perimeter of the shelter, checking for any signs of life, any scraps of food. He'd hunt mice in the tall grass that grew around the edges of the property, his instincts honed by necessity. But most of his time was spent at the gate, his gaze fixed on the dusty, unpaved road that led to the shelter. He sat there, unwavering, a tiny, furry sentinel, waiting. Not just waiting, but expecting. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. In the evenings, the temperature plummeted, a harsh reminder of the approaching Montana winter. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the clouds gathering like dark, bruised fists. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of hardship. Rusty shivered, but he didn't move from his post. He was waiting. Frank's house, a small, sturdy bungalow on the outskirts of the tiny town of Harmony Creek, population 382, was neat to the point of austerity. Not a speck of dust dared to settle on the polished surfaces. The curtains were always drawn, casting the interior in a perpetual twilight. The only sound was the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a constant reminder of the passage of time, time that seemed to stretch endlessly before Frank. His days were as regimented as the rows of canned goods in his pantry. He woke at precisely 6 a.m., made a pot of coffee, black, no sugar, ate a single piece of toast, and then went for his walk. He walked the same route every day, past the same houses, the same fields, the same faces. He rarely spoke to anyone, offering only a curt nod in greeting if acknowledged. He was a tall man, stooped with age and grief, his once strong frame now gaunt. His hands, calloused from years of working as a carpenter, trembled slightly. His eyes, a faded blue, held a deep sadness, a weariness that seemed to have settled into his very bones. It had been 3 years since Eleanor had passed. 3 years since the laughter had gone out of his life, leaving behind this hollow silence. He could still see her, though, as clearly as if she were standing before him. Eleanor, with her bright smile, her kind eyes, and her boundless love for all creatures, great and small. He remembered their first date, a picnic in a field of wildflowers. He'd been nervous, awkward, but she put him at ease with her easy laughter and her genuine interest in everything he had to say. He remembered their wedding day, the way she'd looked in her simple white dress, her face radiant with happiness. He remembered the countless evenings they'd spent together, talking, laughing, simply enjoying each other's company. And he remembered their shared passion, animals. They'd volunteered at Happy Paws Haven for years, walking dogs, cleaning cages, fostering kittens. Eleanor had a special gift with animals. They seemed to sense her gentle spirit. She had a particular fondness for the older, overlooked animals, the ones that no one else wanted. They'd adopted several over the years, each one finding a loving home with them. Their last dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Buster, had died just a year before Eleanor. The grief had hit Frank hard. He'd withdrawn into himself, shutting out the world, avoiding anything that reminded him of Eleanor. He'd stopped going to the shelter, stopped seeing their friends, stopped living, really. He existed, going through the motions, but the joy was gone. His garden, once Eleanor's pride and joy, was now overgrown with weeds. The rose bushes she'd so carefully tended were choked with thorns. His workshop, where he'd spent countless hours crafting beautiful furniture, was silent, his tools gathering dust. A half-finished rocking horse, intended for a grandchild they never had, sat in the corner, a poignant reminder of unfulfilled dreams. Today, however, Frank felt a strange restlessness. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a pull, a compulsion to deviate from his usual route. He turned down a different street, a narrow, winding lane that led out of town towards the open countryside. He didn't know where he was going, but he felt drawn, inexplicably, towards the old, abandoned animal shelter. It was a place he had consciously avoided for 3 years, a place that held too many memories. But today, something was different. Today, he was going back. The shelter came into view slowly, a dilapidated silhouette against the vast Montana sky. Frank's pace slowed as he approached, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. Memories flooded back, sharp and bittersweet. He could almost hear Eleanor's voice, her laughter echoing in the wind. He stopped a short distance from the gate, his eyes scanning the deserted yard. It looked even worse than he remembered, a testament to time and neglect. He felt a pang of guilt, a sense of responsibility for having abandoned the place, for having abandoned the animals Eleanor had loved so much. And then he saw him. Rusty was sitting at the gate, exactly as he always did, his amber eyes fixed on the road. He didn't move, didn't flinch as Frank approached. He simply watched, his gaze unwavering. There was a cautious curiosity in his eyes, but no fear. Frank stopped a few feet away, his breath catching in his throat. The cat was thin, his fur matted, but there was something about him, a certain dignity, a quiet resilience that struck Frank deeply. He saw a reflection of his own loneliness in those amber eyes. "Hello there," Frank said softly, his voice raspy from disuse. Rusty blinked slowly, but didn't reply. He continued to study Frank, assessing him. Frank felt a strange mixture of emotions swirling within him. Sadness, of course, but also a flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A connection. He thought of Eleanor, of her unwavering compassion for animals. He remembered the promise he'd made to her, on her deathbed, to always care for the creatures she loved. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the remains of the sandwich he'd packed for his lunch. It was a simple ham and cheese, but it was all he had. He held it out towards Rusty, slowly, carefully. "Here you go," he said. "I don't know if you like ham, but—" Rusty watched the sandwich, his nose twitching. He took a tentative step forward, then another. He sniffed the offering, then delicately took a small bite. He chewed slowly, savoring the taste. Frank watched him, a faint smile touching his lips. It was a small thing, offering a sandwich to a stray cat, but felt significant. It felt like a beginning. He stayed there for a few minutes, watching Rusty eat. Then he turned and walked away, back towards home. But he knew he'd be back. He had to be. The next day, Frank returned to the shelter at the same time, carrying a can of tuna and a small bowl of water. Rusty was waiting at the gate, his tail twitching slightly as he saw Frank approach. He didn't run, didn't hide. He simply waited. "Good afternoon," Frank said, placing the food and water on the ground. "I brought you something a little better today." Rusty approached cautiously, sniffing the tuna with obvious interest. He began to eat, purring softly, a low rumble in his chest. Frank sat down on a nearby rock, watching him. This became their routine. Every day, Frank would visit the shelter, bringing food and water for Rusty. He talked to him at first about the weather, the changing seasons, the news he'd heard on the radio. Gradually, he started talking about Eleanor. "She would have loved you," he said one day, his voice thick with emotion. "She had a soft spot for gingers. We had one once, named Marmalade. He was a real character." Rusty, his belly full of tuna, looked up at Frank, his amber eyes seeming to hold a deep understanding. He rubbed against Frank's leg, purring louder. The trust grew slowly, incrementally. At first, Rusty would only approach when Frank placed the food down and stepped away. Gradually, he started to eat while Frank was close by. Then, he started to allow Frank to touch him, a tentative stroke of his head, a scratch behind his ears. One day, a local farmer, Jed, stopped his truck as he was passing by the shelter. He rolled down his window and looked at Frank with a mixture of amusement and pity. "You wasting your time with that one, Frank," Jed said. "He's just a feral cat. Been out here for years. Ain't no taming him." Frank bristled slightly. "He's not just a feral cat," he said. He's got a name. He's Rusty." Jed chuckled. "Rusty, huh? Well, good luck with that. Just don't get too attached. These wild ones, they don't stick around." Jed drove off, leaving Frank feeling even more determined to care for Rusty. He wouldn't let him down. He wouldn't abandon him. The days turned into weeks. The weather grew colder, the first snowflakes beginning to fall. Frank started to worry about Rusty staying out in the cold. He knew he had to do something. He had to bring him home. It was a sunny afternoon, but the air was crisp with the bite of approaching winter. Frank had brought Rusty a special treat, a small piece of roasted chicken. Rusty devoured it, purring contentedly. Frank sat down beside him, stroking his soft fur. "Rusty," he said, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking that it's getting cold. Too cold for you to be out here. I want you to come home with me." He'd been practicing this speech in his head for days, but now that the words were out, he felt a surge of anxiety. What if Rusty refused? What if he ran away? Rusty looked up at him, his amber eyes unblinking. He seemed to understand. He let out a soft meow, a sound that seemed to say, "Okay." It was the sound. The soft okay. That decided for him. Frank made up his mind. The journey home was a short one, just a few miles down the road, but it felt like a momentous occasion. Frank had brought a cardboard box lined with an old blanket, but Rusty refused to stay in it. He perched precariously on the passenger seat of Frank's old pickup truck, his body tense, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "It's all right, Rusty," Frank said, trying to reassure him. "We're almost there. You'll be safe and warm." The house felt strange to Rusty. He'd spent his entire life outdoors, in the wild, in the relative freedom of the abandoned shelter. The enclosed spaces, the unfamiliar smells, the soft surfaces under his paws, it was all overwhelming. He explored cautiously, sniffing every corner, every piece of furniture. He jumped onto the sofa, then quickly jumped off, startled by the unfamiliar sensation of sinking into the cushions. He found a fireplace, cold and empty now, but still holding the faint scent of wood smoke. He circled it, sniffing, then settled down nearby, his body curled into a tight ball. Frank watched him, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He knew it would take time for Rusty to adjust. He'd prepared a space for him in the spare bedroom, with a comfortable bed, a litter box, and bowls of food and water. But he knew that Rusty would ultimately choose his own spot. "This is your home now, Rusty," Frank said softly. "You're safe here." The first night was restless. Rusty paced the house, meowing softly, exploring every nook and cranny. He jumped onto Frank's bed, startling him awake, then quickly jumped off again. He seemed unsure of where to settle. Frank got up and followed him, talking to him softly, reassuring him. Finally, Rusty curled up on the rug beside Frank's bed, his body close to the warmth of the radiator. He purred softly, a low rumble that filled the quiet room. Frank lay in bed, listening to Rusty's purring, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer alone. He had a companion, a friend, a reason to get up in the morning. He had Rusty, and Rusty finally had a home. The house, which had been so silent and filled with only the echoes of the past, now felt alive again, warmed by the presence of the small ginger cat who had wandered into Frank's life and, unexpectedly, filled the void left by Eleanor. The days settled into a comfortable routine. Frank would wake up early, and Rusty would be there, waiting for him, his tail twitching expectantly. Frank would make coffee, and Rusty would supervise from his perch on the kitchen counter, occasionally batting at the steam rising from the mug. Breakfast was a shared affair. Frank would eat his toast, and Rusty would have his kibble, occasionally supplemented with a small piece of chicken or fish. Frank would talk to Rusty throughout the day about anything and everything. He'd tell him about the news, about the weather, about his plans for the day. He'd even read aloud to him from the newspaper, though Rusty seemed more interested in the crinkling sound of the paper than the words themselves. Rusty followed Frank around the house like a ginger shadow. He'd sit at Frank's feet while he worked in his workshop, now reopened and filled with the scent of sawdust and varnish. He'd curl up on the sofa beside him while he watched television in the evenings, purring contentedly. He'd sleep on Frank's bed, nestled against his side, a warm, comforting presence. Frank's life began to blossom again, slowly but surely. He started tending to his neglected garden, pulling weeds, pruning the rose bushes, planting new flowers. He even started working on a half-finished rocking horse again, his hands finding their old skill, his heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't over Eleanor's death, he knew he never would be, but he was learning to live with the grief, to find joy in the small things, to appreciate the companionship of his furry friend. The flashbacks continued, weaving their way through Frank's present like threads of gold in a tapestry. He remembered the time Eleanor had rescued a litter of orphan kittens from a flooded barn, nursing them back to health with a bottle and a dropper. He remembered the day they'd adopted Buster, their scruffy terrier mix, from the shelter, the way he'd wag his tail so hard his whole body had wiggled. He remembered the countless evenings they'd spent sitting on their porch, watching the sunset, Buster asleep at their feet. One evening, Rusty was playing with a ball of yarn that Frank had found in Eleanor's sewing basket. He batted it around the room, chasing it with playful energy. The sight triggered a vivid memory of Eleanor knitting a sweater for a scrawny, shivering kitten they'd rescued one winter. The sweater had been bright red, ridiculously oversized for the tiny creature, but it had kept him warm. "She would have loved to see you playing like that, Rusty," Frank said, his voice choked with emotion. There were moments of quiet contentment, moments that filled Frank's heart with a warmth he thought he'd lost forever. Watching Rusty chase butterflies in the garden, seeing him curled up asleep in a sunbeam, hearing his soft purr in the quiet of the night, these were the small joys that made life worth living again. But even in this newfound happiness, there was an underlying fragility. Frank knew that Rusty was an old cat. He didn't know exactly how old, but he could see the signs, the slight stiffness in his gait, the increasing amount of time he spent sleeping. He cherished every moment, knowing that their time together was precious and finite. He was acutely aware that this second chance at companionship could be snatched away just as suddenly as the first. The first sign was subtle. Rusty started sleeping more. Not just the usual cat naps, but long, deep sleeps from which he'd wake slowly, seeming a little disoriented. Frank noticed it, but tried to dismiss it. It was just old age, he told himself. Cats sleep a lot. Then, he noticed that Rusty's appetite was waning. He'd always been a good eater, eagerly devouring whatever Frank put in front of him. Now, he picked at his food, eating only a few bites before turning away. Frank tried different brands, different flavors, even tempting him with small pieces of cooked chicken or fish, but Rusty's interest remained minimal. His playful energy, which had been so evident when he first arrived, began to diminish. He still followed Frank around the house, but he no longer chased after balls of yarn or batted at dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. He spent most of his time curled up at his favorite spot, the rug by the radiator, his body seeming smaller, frilier. Frank watched him with growing concern, his heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. He knew, deep down, what was happening, but he couldn't bring himself to accept it. He tried to convince himself that it was just a temporary phase, that Rusty would bounce back. But the signs continued to accumulate. Rusty's gait became stiffer, his movements slower, more deliberate. He sometimes stumbled slightly, as if his legs couldn't quite support his weight. He started to groom himself less frequently, his once glossy ginger fur becoming dull and matted in places. Frank finally made the appointment he'd been dreading. He called Dr. Emily Carter, the local veterinarian, a kind, compassionate woman who had known both Frank and Eleanor for years. The visit to the vet was a blur of anxiety and fear. Dr. Carter examined Rusty gently, thoroughly, asking Frank questions about his behavior, his appetite, his overall health. She took blood samples, listened to his heart and lungs, palpated his abdomen. The wait for the results was agonizing. Frank sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the closed door of the examination room. He could hear the muffled sounds of Dr. Carter talking to her assistant, the occasional meow from Rusty. Finally, Dr. Carter emerged, her expression somber. She led Frank into her office, a small, cozy room filled with books and framed pictures of animals. She sat down behind her desk, her gaze meeting Frank's directly. "Frank," she said gently, "I'm afraid I have some bad news. Rusty is a very old cat, and his health is failing. The blood tests show that he has advanced kidney failure. His heart is also weak." Frank felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He'd known, deep down, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real, undeniable. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Carter sighed. "We can try to manage his symptoms," she said. "We can put him on a special diet, give him medication to help with his kidney function and his heart. But I have to be honest with you, Frank. It won't cure him. It will only buy him some time, and I can't guarantee the quality of that time." She paused, her gaze filled with compassion. "I know this is difficult, Frank, but I think you need to consider what's best for Rusty. He's in pain, and he's only going to get worse. We could try to prolong his life, but it might mean more suffering for him. The kindest thing, sometimes, is to let them go." Euthanasia. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Frank felt a lump form in his throat, tears stinging his eyes. He couldn't imagine saying goodbye to Rusty. Not yet. Not ever. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't and I won't. I promised him I'd take care of him. I won't let him suffer, but I won't give up on him either." Dr. Carter nodded understandingly. "I respect your decision, Frank. We'll do everything we can to make Rusty comfortable. I'll prescribe some medication, and we'll talk about a special diet. You'll need to bring him back for regular checkups." Frank left the vet's office with a bag full of medications and a heavy heart. He drove home slowly, Rusty curled up in his carrier, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil raging within Frank. The following days were a blur of medication, special food, and constant worry. Frank administered the pills, struggling to get Rusty to swallow them. He prepared the special diet, coaxing Rusty to eat, even if it was just a few bites. He spent every possible moment with him, talking to him, stroking his fur, trying to provide comfort. He was reliving the pain of Eleanor's death, but this time it was different. He was older, wearier, and the thought of facing the world alone again was almost unbearable. But he also knew that he had to be strong for Rusty. He had to be the anchor, the comfort, the one who would see him through to the end. He found himself talking to Eleanor, as if she were there in the room with him. "I'm trying, Eleanor," he whispered. "I'm trying to do what you would have done. I'm trying to be strong for him." He knew he was in denial, clinging to the hope that Rusty would somehow miraculously recover. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was losing his friend, his companion, the the little ginger cat who had brought light back into his life. And he was powerless to stop it. Rusty's decline accelerated. He grew weaker, his movements becoming increasingly labored. He spent most of his time sleeping, his body curled into a tight ball, his breathing shallow and raspy. He rarely purred anymore. Frank stayed by his side constantly, watching over him like a guardian angel. He'd set up a comfortable bed for Rusty in the living room, near the fireplace, so he could be close to him at all times. He'd talk to him softly, stroking his fur, telling him stories about Eleanor, about their life together, about the animals they'd loved. "Remember Buster, Rusty?" he'd say, his voice choked with emotion. "He was a good dog, wasn't he? He'd have liked you. You would have been friends." He'd talk about their time at the shelter, about the joy Eleanor had found in helping animals, about the promise he'd made to her. He'd talk about his regrets, the things he wished he'd done differently, the time he wished he'd spent more wisely. "I should have taken more walks with her, Rusty," he said one evening, tears streaming down his face. "I should have told her I loved her more often. I should have. He couldn't finish the sentence. The grief was too overwhelming. He buried his face in Rusty's soft fur, his body shaking with sobs. Rusty, weak as he was, seemed to sense Frank's distress. He lifted his head slightly, nuzzling against Frank's hand, a faint purr rumbling in his chest. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to comfort Frank, to remind him that he wasn't alone. One particularly cold night, Frank built a fire in the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow over the room. He sat in his armchair, Rusty nestled in his lap, wrapped in a soft blanket. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and Rusty's shallow breathing. Frank looked down at Rusty, his heart aching with love and sorrow. He knew the end was near. He could see it in Rusty's eyes, in the way his body had grown so frail, so fragile. He stroked his fur gently, whispering words of comfort, of love, of gratitude. "Thank you, Rusty," he said. "Thank you for coming into my life. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for everything." He fell asleep in his chair, holding Rusty close, his hand resting on his small, warm body. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the final hours. Frank woke with a start, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. He felt a chill in the air, the fire having died down to embers. He looked down at Rusty, still nestled in his lap, wrapped in the blanket. He knew immediately. Rusty's body was still, his breathing had stopped. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful. He was gone. Frank felt a wave of grief wash over him, so intense, so overwhelming, that it took his breath away. He held Rusty's body close, his tears falling onto his soft ginger fur. He rocked back and forth, his body shaking with sobs. "Oh, Rusty," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." The house felt empty, silent, the way it had felt after Eleanor died. But this time, it was even worse. This time, there was no hope of companionship, no flicker of light in the darkness. He stayed there for a long time, holding Rusty, crying, grieving. He didn't know how much time passed. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. Finally, he knew he had to do what needed to be done. He gently wrapped Rusty in the blanket, his hands trembling. He carried him outside, into the cold morning air, towards the old animal shelter. He walked slowly, his steps heavy, his heart aching with every beat. He reached the shelter, the place where they'd first met, the place where Rusty had waited patiently for him to arrive. He found the spot under the tree, in front of the gate, where Rusty had spent so many hours watching the road. He knelt down, his knees aching, and began to dig. The ground was hard, frozen, but he persevered, his tears mixing with the soil. He dug a deep grave, lining it with soft leaves and grass. He gently placed Rusty's body inside, wrapping the blanket around him like a shroud. He stood there for a moment, looking down at his friend, his companion, the little ginger cat who had brought so much love and joy into his life. He spoke to him, his voice choked with emotion. "Goodbye, Rusty," he said. "Thank you for everything. You were the best friend a man could ask for. I'll never forget you. I promise. I'll always remember you and Eleanor and all the animals we loved. Rest in peace, my friend." He filled the grave, covering Rusty with the cold earth. He patted the soil down gently, his hands lingering on the spot where his friend lay buried. He stood there for a long time, his gaze fixed on the small mound of earth, the only marker of Rusty's final resting place. The return to the empty house was brutal. Every corner held a memory of Rusty. His food bowl, still half full, sat on the kitchen floor. His favorite toy, a small, stuffed mouse, lay abandoned on the rug by the fireplace. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of the life that had been lived and lost. Frank felt a profound sense of loneliness, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He wandered through the house, touching the places where Rusty had slept, where he'd played, where he'd simply been. He picked up the stuffed mouse, holding it close, his tears falling onto its worn fabric. He sat in his armchair, the same chair where he'd held Rusty on their last night together. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure up the feeling of Rusty's warm body nestled in his lap, the sound of his soft purr. But it was no use. He was gone. The first few days were the hardest. Frank went through the motions of living, eating, sleeping, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt lost, adrift, without purpose. He missed Rusty terribly, the small routines they'd shared, the companionship, the unconditional love. But then, slowly, gradually, something began to shift. He thought about Rusty's life, about the way he'd waited patiently at the shelter gate, about the trust he'd placed in Frank, about the joy he'd brought into his life, even in his old age. He thought about Eleanor, about her unwavering love for animals, about the promise he'd made to her. He realized that he couldn't let his grief consume him. He had to honor Rusty's memory, Eleanor's memory, by continuing to live, by continuing to care. He had to find a way to carry their love with him, to let it guide him, to give him strength. He decided to go back to the shelter. He packed a bag with food and water, not just for cats, but for any other stray animals that might be there. He drove slowly, his heart heavy, but also filled with a sense of purpose. He arrived at the shelter, the familiar sight of the dilapidated building triggering a fresh wave of sadness. He parked his truck, got out, and walked toward the gate. There were no animals waiting for him. The yard was empty, silent. But Frank wasn't deterred. He left the food and water near the gate, in the same spot where he'd first met Rusty. He visited Rusty's grave, kneeling down, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked along the way. He spoke to him, telling him about his day, about his plans, about his promise to continue caring for other animals. This became his new routine. Every day, he'd visit the shelter, bringing food and water, checking for any signs of life. He'd spend time at Rusty's grave, talking to him, remembering him, honoring his memory. He started to notice other things. He saw the tracks of a raccoon, the droppings of a deer, the signs of birds nesting in the eaves of the old building. He realized that even though the shelter was abandoned, it was still a haven for wildlife, a place where creatures could find refuge. He started to make small repairs, fixing broken fences, patching holes in the roof, clearing away debris. He couldn't bring the shelter back to its former glory, but he could make it a little safer, a little more welcoming. He found a sense of peace in this work, a sense of connection to Rusty, to Eleanor, to all the animals he'd loved. He was still sad, he still missed them terribly, but he was no longer consumed by grief. He'd found a way to channel his sorrow into something positive, something meaningful. One afternoon, as he was leaving the shelter, he saw a small, skinny cat dart across the road and disappear into the tall grass. He stopped, his heart pounding. He couldn't be sure, but he thought it might have been a calico. He left extra food that day, and the next and the next. He didn't see the cat again, but he knew it was there. He could feel it. He continued his visits, his work, his quiet acts of kindness. He knew he couldn't replace Rusty. He couldn't bring back Eleanor. But he could honor their memory by continuing to love, to care, to make a difference in the lives of other creatures. He looked out at the road, the same road Rusty had watched so patiently, and he felt a sense of connection, not just to Rusty, but to Eleanor and to all the animals he'd loved. He was not alone. Their love, their memory, lived on within him, guiding him, giving him strength. And as long as he kept that love alive, he would never truly be alone. The sun set on the Montana plains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the same colors as Rusty's fur. And Frank, standing by the gate of the old animal shelter, felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet understanding that even in loss, there is love, and even in darkness, there is light. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he was exactly where he was meant to be.
The injured baby monkey, lying by the stream, was discovered by an orange cat. What happened next shocked everyone. The autumn air in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina carried the crisp scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. For days, a relentless cold rain had lashed the forested slopes, turning familiar animal trails into slick mudslides and swelling gentle streams into churning brown torrents. It was amidst this chaos that Pip found himself utterly, terrifyingly alone. Pip was a young capuchin monkey, barely more than a baby, with wide, intelligent eyes the color of dark honey and fur like soft brown moss. He shouldn't have been there at all. Capuchins weren't native to these sprawling temperate forests. He was cargo, part of an illegal exotic pet transport moving north under the cover of darkness and stormy weather. The old van, rattling along a poorly maintained mountain road, had hit a deep pothole obscured by rainwater. The jolt had been violent, throwing Pip against the bars of his small, inadequate cage. Worse, the impact had sprung the flimsy latch. In the ensuing confusion, the driver cursing, the van skidding the back door had flown open for a heart-stopping moment. Fear overriding everything else, Pip had scrambled out, tumbling down a steep, muddy embankment obscured by thickets of rhododendron. He landed hard near the edge of a newly swollen creek, the icy water shocking his small body. Pain shot through his left leg, a sharp, searing agony from his hip down to his ankle. He tried to stand, but the leg buckled beneath him. He could hear the van's engine grinding as it corrected its course, the sound fading quickly back onto the road above. He chirped, a high-pitched sound of distress, but it was lost in the drumming of the rain and the roar of the creek. He was alone. Hours passed. The rain eventually lessened to a miserable drizzle, but the cold seeped into Pip's bones. He huddled near the base of a large oak tree, shivering violently. His leg throbbed with a deep ache, and a raw scrape on his arm stung relentlessly. Hunger gnawed at his belly. He didn't know how to find food in this strange, dripping world. He missed the familiar warmth of his mother, the rough and tumble play with his siblings, vague, fragmented memories from a life before the cage. Now, there was only the vast, indifferent forest, the menacing rush of the water, and the overwhelming sense of being small and lost. He dragged himself closer to the stream, instinctively seeking water, but the current looked powerful and dangerous. He lapped weakly at a puddle formed in a cluster of rocks, the cold water doing little to soothe his fear or hunger. Exhaustion began to weigh heavily on him. His eyelids felt like lead. He tried to stay alert, his large eyes scanning the dense undergrowth, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. He didn't know what Dangers lurked here, owls, foxes, perhaps larger predators he couldn't even imagine. All he knew was the primal instinct to survive, an instinct rapidly being overwhelmed by pain, cold, and despair. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, painting the wet leaves in shades of gray and purple, Pip lay down on a patch of damp moss, his small body trembling uncontrollably. He curled into a tight ball, his injured leg tucked protectively beneath him. The world was fading into a blur of misery, and he wasn't sure he would see the morning. Life for the orange tabby cat, known only to the forest creatures as Ginger, was a solitary, often harsh existence. She'd been born in a barn on the edge of the nearby village, but a farmer's dog with a taste for chasing cats had made her early life precarious. She'd learned quickly to be self-sufficient, finding refuge and sustenance in the sprawling national forest that bordered the farmland. She was a survivor, lean, muscular, with keen senses and a coat the color of autumn leaves, perfect camouflage in the undergrowth. Ginger had found meager shelter from the worst of the storm beneath a rocky overhang, curled tightly, her fur damp despite her efforts. She hadn't eaten well in days. The relentless rain made hunting difficult, silencing the usual rustlings of mice and voles. As the rain eased and the first hints of evening emerged, hunger drove her out. She moved silently through the wet woods, paws barely disturbing the leaf litter, ears twitching, nose sampling the damp air for any scent of prey. It wasn't the scent of mouse or squirrel that caught her attention first, but a sound, a faint, intermittent whimper, almost too high-pitched for her usual prey. Curiosity, a powerful instinct in any cat, pulled her forward. She followed the sound, moving with practiced stealth, staying low among the ferns and mountain laurel. She paused at the edge of a clearing near the swollen creek. Her sharp eyes, adapted for low light, quickly spotted the source of the sound, a small brown furry creature huddled miserably near the water's edge. It wasn't anything she recognized. It wasn't a rabbit or a raccoon kit or even a large squirrel. It smelled different, foreign, and it smelled of fear and pain. Ginger watched for a long moment, motionless as a stone. The small creature shivered violently, occasionally letting out that soft, distressed chirp. It seemed weak, vulnerable. Normally, Ginger might have seen it merely as potential, albeit unusual prey. But something stayed her paw. Perhaps it was the sheer misery radiating from the small form. Perhaps it was a flicker of a different instinct. She had lost a litter of kittens to a harsh winter 2 seasons ago, and the tiny, helpless sounds stirred a faint, confusing echo of maternal feeling. Or perhaps it was simply the alien nature of the creature that sparked caution rather than aggression. Slowly, deliberately, she emerged from the bushes. She kept her body low, her tail still, signaling non-aggression in the universal language of felines. Pip saw the flash of orange fur and froze, terror seizing him, a new threat. He braced himself, every muscle tense, ready to try a futile scramble away despite his injured leg. But the cat didn't lunge. It stopped a few feet away, regarding him with intense, unblinking green eyes. It made a low, soft sound in its throat, not quite a purr, not quite a growl, more of a questioning rumble. Pip remained frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Ginger took another tentative step forward. She could clearly smell the injury now, the tang of blood mixed with the damp fur. She lowered her head, sniffing at the scraped arm. Pip flinched, but didn't have the energy to pull away. Then Ginger did something unexpected. She extended her rough pink tongue and gave the scrape a tentative lick. It wasn't necessarily an act of comfort in the human sense, more an investigation, a tasting, a feline way of assessing the situation. The rasping tongue startled Pip, but it didn't hurt. The cat then seemed to notice how close Pip was to the rushing water. The creek, still high from the rains, eddied dangerously close to where he lay. With a low murmur, Ginger nudged Pip firmly with her head, away from the water's edge. Pip, startled and confused, tried to resist, but the cat was persistent, nudging him again and again until he had shifted a few crucial feet onto drier ground, further beneath the sheltering branches of the oak. Ginger didn't leave. As the last light faded and the chill of the mountain night deepened, she circled the spot where Pip lay shivering, then settled down nearby. She didn't curl up against him, not yet, but close enough that a small measure of her body heat radiated outwards. Pip, exhausted beyond measure and bewildered by this strange turn of events, felt a tiny spark of something other than fear. He was still cold, still hungry, still hurt, but the presence of the orange cat, silent and watchful nearby, was a strange, unexpected anchor in the terrifying darkness. He closed his eyes, the cat's quiet presence a bizarre counterpoint to the rush of the nearby creek, and finally succumbed to a troubled sleep. Martha Dubois had lived in her small cabin, nestled just inside the forest line, for over 40 years. She was 72, a widow for the last decade since her husband George, a retired park ranger, had passed away. The cabin, filled with George's wildlife books and her own needlepoint creations, was her sanctuary. Her routine was simple, governed by the seasons and the rhythm of the forest she loved. Each morning, weather permitting, she took a walk along a familiar path that looped up onto a low ridge overlooking the creek. It was her time to observe the deer grazing in the early mist, the pileated woodpeckers hammering at dead trees, the changing colors of the leaves. The morning after the big storm broke clear and bright, the sunlight filtering through the wet leaves like stained glass. Martha pulled on her sturdy walking boots and her favorite worn cardigan, breathing in the clean, rain-washed air. As she reached the crest of the ridge, her usual spot with a view down toward the creek, she paused, binoculars raised to scan for birds. That's when she saw it. Movement near the base of the old oak tree by the water. She focused the binoculars, expecting a raccoon or perhaps a fox, scavenging after the storm. What she saw made her gasp, lowering the binoculars to rub her eyes before raising them again, convinced she was mistaken. There, curled on a patch of moss, was Ginger. Martha knew the stray orange cat by sight. She occasionally left food out for her on the back porch during harsh weather, though the cat remained fiercely independent and wary. But it wasn't Ginger alone that shocked Martha. Curled tentatively near the cat, almost nestled against her flank, was a small monkey. A monkey, here in the North Carolina mountains. Martha's mind raced. It had to be an escaped pet. George had always warned about the illegal exotic animal trade, the cruelty and the dangers of animals escaping or being released into environments where they couldn't survive. The poor creature looked small and miserable, but the truly astonishing part was Ginger. The cat wasn't attacking the monkey. She seemed to be protecting it. Martha watched, utterly transfixed, for the better part of an hour. She saw the monkey Pip, she mentally named him, the name popping into her head for no particular reason, stir and shift, favoring one leg as he moved stiffly. He looked thin and weak. Ginger watched him, seemingly unconcerned by his proximity. When a blue jay swooped down, squawking aggressively near Pip, Ginger instantly rose, flattened her ears, and hissed, driving the bird away into the trees. Then she settled back down, giving Pip a brief, almost dismissive lick on the top of his head before closing her eyes again. Martha felt a lump form in her throat. George would have been fascinated. He'd always said nature was full of surprises, that animal behavior often defied human expectations. But this, a wild stray cat seemingly adopting an escaped baby monkey, it was extraordinary. She spent the rest of the day wrestling with what to do. Her first instinct was to call the park service or animal control. An escaped monkey needed to be rescued, cared for properly, perhaps taken to a sanctuary. It couldn't survive out here alone, especially injured. But then she thought of Ginger. If authorities came, they would likely trap the monkey. What would happen to the cat? Would they separate this fragile, unbelievable bond? Would the stress of capture harm the already weakened monkey? And there was something else, something deeper. Observing the pair from her ridgetop vantage point, she felt a sense of privilege, of witnessing something rare and strangely beautiful. The fierce independence of the stray cat, tempered by this unexpected tenderness. The desperate vulnerability of the monkey, finding solace in the most unlikely of companions. It spoke to a resilience, a connection that transcended species, that felt almost sacred in its improbability. By evening, Martha hadn't made any calls. She had decided for now to simply watch and wait. She couldn't bring herself to interfere just yet. She would keep a close eye on them. Perhaps she could help indirectly, ensure they had food and water without disturbing their sanctuary. She felt a sense of responsibility now, not just for the lost monkey, but for the strange little family that had formed under the old oak tree by the creek. She went to bed that night thinking of the orange cat and the baby monkey, their images vivid in her mind, a testament to the wild, unpredictable heart of the forest she called home. Martha's decision to observe, rather than immediately intervene, solidified into a daily ritual. Each morning and late afternoon, she'd make her way to the ridge, binoculars in hand, her heart filled with a mixture of anxiety and wonder. She needed to help, but carefully. Her first step was food. She knew Ginger sometimes scavenged near her cabin, so the cat was familiar with her scent, if not her presence. Late one afternoon, Martha walked a wider loop, approaching the area near the oak tree from downwind, moving slowly and quietly. She stopped about 30 yards away, well hidden by the foliage. She placed a small, unlocked plastic container on a flat rock. Inside, she'd put a handful of high-quality dry cat food, a few slices of cooked chicken left over from her own dinner, and, remembering monkeys often ate fruit, a ripe banana, peeled and broken into chunks. She also placed a shallow dish of fresh water nearby, knowing the creek water might still be murky from the storm. Then she retreated as silently as she had come. Back on her ridge perch the next morning, she watched with bated breath. Ginger, ever cautious, approached the offerings warily. She sniffed extensively around the container and the dish, her tail twitching. After several minutes of careful assessment, she began to eat the chicken and cat food, casting frequent glances towards the surrounding woods. Pip, watching from his spot near the oak's roots, chirped softly. He seemed interested but hesitant, perhaps intimidated by the cat or unsure of the strange bounty. Ginger finished her portion and, surprisingly, nudged the container slightly towards Pip with her nose before moving a short distance away to groom herself. Tentatively, Pip limped forward. He ignored the cat food but grabbed a piece of banana with his small, dexterous hands, stuffing it quickly into his mouth, his dark eyes wide. He ate rapidly, finishing the banana and even sampling a small piece of chicken. Martha let out a sigh of relief. She hadn't realized she was holding. They were eating. This became the new routine. Martha replenished the food and water daily, varying the offerings grapes, berries, hard-boiled eggs, alongside the cat food. Ginger seemed to understand, or at least accept, the source of this reliable sustenance, though she never allowed Martha to get close. Pip visibly began to regain some strength. His limp lessened slightly, though he still favored the leg, and his coat seemed a little thicker, less matted. The bond between the two animals deepened in subtle ways that Martha found endlessly fascinating. Pip, naturally curious and social, started mimicking Ginger. When she groomed herself, he would meticulously pick through his own fur. When she stretched languidly in a patch of sun, he would attempt his own awkward version. He began to follow her more closely when she moved short distances, sometimes making small, tentative hops to keep up. Ginger, for her part, tolerated Pip's increasing closeness with a sort of gruff patience. She never initiated play, but she didn't rebuff him entirely when he occasionally tried to playfully bat at her twitching tail. Martha witnessed Ginger sharing food more consistently, sometimes leaving a portion of the chicken or letting Pip eat the fruit first. The cat's protectiveness remained fierce. Martha saw her chase away not just birds, but also a large, inquisitive raccoon that ambled too close one evening, Ginger puffing up her fur and letting out a menacing yowl that sent the larger animal lumbering away. Pip's reliance on Ginger was palpable. He clearly saw her as his protector, his anchor. When sudden noises startled him, a falling branch, the distant sound of a truck, he would scramble towards Ginger, sometimes even attempting to cling to her fur, a gesture she usually shook off with mild annoyance, but never aggression. They slept closer together now, often curled near each other, though not quite touching, sharing the warmth of the fading autumn days. Martha documented her observations in an old journal, filling pages with notes about their interactions, Pip's recovery, Ginger's subtle shifts in behavior. She felt like a naturalist studying a rare phenomenon, but it was more personal than that. She felt emotionally invested in their survival, in their strange, interspecies friendship. She found herself talking to George's photograph in the evenings, telling him about the orange cat and the baby monkey, about the resilience she witnessed daily. It eased her own loneliness, filled a space she hadn't realized was quite so empty. The woods felt different now, holding a secret, a small miracle she was privileged to guard. She knew, however, that the approaching winter and Pip's unresolved injury meant this fragile peace couldn't last forever. A difficult decision loomed, casting a shadow over the quiet wonder of their days. As October bled into November, the vibrant autumn colors faded to shades of brown and gray. The nights grow colder, frost silvering the ground most mornings. Martha's anxiety increased with the falling temperatures. Pip was looking better, more active, his coat thicker, but he was still a tropical animal in a rapidly cooling temperate forest. And his limp, though improved, persisted. A cold snap or a heavy snowfall could be disastrous. Ginger, too, seemed more focused on hunting, perhaps sensing the coming scarcity of winter. One crisp afternoon, Martha's quiet observation was shattered. A pair of hikers, loud and oblivious, strayed from the main trail, crashing through the underbrush near the creek. Martha, watching from her ridge, held her breath. Ginger immediately went on high alert, flattening herself to the ground, eyes fixed on the intruders. Pip, terrified by the loud voices and snapping twigs, scrambled towards Ginger, chittering in fear. The hikers emerged into the clearing. "Whoa, look!" one of them shouted, pointing. "Is that a monkey? What the heck is a monkey doing here?" The other raised his phone. "And a cat! Get a picture, quick!" Ginger hissed, a low, menacing sound, backing slowly towards the dense rhododendron bushes, trying to shield Pip behind her. Pip clung desperately to her side. The hikers took a few steps closer, fascinated and noisy. Martha couldn't bear it. This intrusion felt like a violation. Before she even thought about it, she scrambled down the gentler slope of the ridge, calling out, "Please, leave them alone! You're frightening them!" The hikers turned, surprised to see the elderly woman emerging from the trees, her face etched with concern. "Sorry, ma'am," one said, lowering his phone slightly. "We just saw the monkey. He's frightened and recovering," Martha said, keeping her voice calm but firm, positioning herself between the hikers and the animals hiding in the bushes. "They're not hurting anything. Please, just go back to the trail. Give them some peace." Perhaps it was her age, her obvious sincerity, or the protective stance she took, but the hikers seemed abashed. Okay. Sorry to bother you. Weird sight, though." They exchanged glances and, after a moment, turned and crashed back the way they came. Martha waited until their voices faded completely before slowly approaching the rhododendrons. Ginger watched her, eyes narrowed, but didn't bolt immediately. Pip peeked out from behind the cat's flank, trembling. "It's okay," Martha murmured softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "They're gone now. You're safe." She didn't try to get closer. She just stood there for a few minutes, letting her calm presence reassure them before slowly backing away and heading home, her heart pounding. The encounter was a stark reminder. Their sanctuary wasn't secure. It also made her realize that direct intervention was becoming necessary. Pip needed proper medical attention for his leg, and neither of them was equipped to survive a harsh mountain winter. The thought of separating them, however, felt like a betrayal. That evening, she made a difficult phone call, not to animal control, but to Dr. Evans, a retired veterinarian in the nearby town who had treated her pets for years and shared her and George's love for animals. She explained the situation hesitantly, expecting skepticism. To her relief, Dr. Evans listened patiently, asking gentle questions. He knew Martha wasn't prone to flights of fancy. "A capuchin, you think? And a feral cat?" he mused. "Well, Martha, stranger things have happened, I suppose. Nature's full of odd couplings. But you're right. That little fellow won't make it through the winter, and the leg needs looking at." He agreed to come out, unofficially, just to observe first. Maybe together they could figure out a plan. He suggested bringing a mild sedative hidden in food for Pip, just in case capture became unavoidable, but stressed they would only use it as a last resort. The next afternoon, Dr. Evans, a kindly man with gentle hands and calm eyes, joined Martha on the ridge. They watched Pip and Ginger interact near the food station Martha had set up. Pip was trying to groom Ginger's back, an attempt she tolerated for a few moments before moving away. "Remarkable," Dr. Evans whispered, adjusting his own binoculars. "You weren't exaggerating. The cat's definitely protective. And the monkey, he looks thin but brighter than I expected. The limp is noticeable, though. Could be a fracture, a dislocation, or severe sprain." They discussed options. A wildlife sanctuary specializing in primates was the best long-term solution for Pip. But transporting him would be stressful, and separating him from Ginger felt cruel. Could a sanctuary possibly take them both? It was highly unusual. "Let's focus on getting the little one help first," Dr. Evans said, pragmatically. "If we can examine him, maybe even get him started on some anti-inflammatories hidden in his food, it might help. Capturing him without traumatizing him or driving the cat away permanently, that's the tricky part." He suggested Martha continue the feeding routine, but try to get slightly closer each day, associating her presence directly with the food, speaking softly. Maybe, just maybe, they could gain enough trust to lure Pip into a carrier, perhaps with Ginger nearby, providing reassurance. It was a long shot, fraught with uncertainty, but it felt better than a sudden traumatic capture or leaving them to face the impending winter alone. Martha agreed, her resolve hardening. She had to try, for both their sakes. The delicate process of trust-building began. Every day Martha brought the food and water, but instead of leaving immediately, she would sit quietly nearby, humming softly or speaking in low, gentle tones. She never made direct eye contact for long, respecting Ginger's feral caution. Ginger remained wary, often watching Martha with narrowed eyes from a short distance while she ate, but she didn't flee as quickly as before. Pip, influenced perhaps by Ginger's grudging acceptance and driven by his own innate curiosity, seemed less fearful of Martha. He would watch her intently, head cocked. On a few occasions, when Martha placed a particularly appealing piece of fruit, like a ripe fig a little closer to herself, Pip darted forward, snatched it, and retreated quickly, his dark eyes glancing back at her. Tiny steps, but steps nonetheless. Dr. Evans visited periodically, observing from a distance and offering advice. He provided Martha with a mild anti-inflammatory medication, easily crushed and mixed into a small portion of banana, which Pip readily consumed. Over a couple of weeks, Martha noticed a definite improvement in Pip's mobility. He still limped, but he seemed less pained, more willing to put weight on the leg, even attempting small, playful jumps occasionally. Meanwhile, Dr. Evans had been making calls. He located a reputable primate sanctuary several hours away. He explained the unique situation the injured capuchin and his unlikely feline guardian. He emphasized the deep bond Martha had witnessed. The sanctuary director was initially skeptical about taking a domestic cat, especially a feral one, into a primate facility. It posed risks of disease transmission and behavioral conflicts. But Dr. Evans was persuasive, sharing Martha's detailed journal entries and emphasizing the psychological importance of the bond for the monkey's recovery and well-being. Reluctantly, the sanctuary agreed to consider taking them both, provided Ginger could be safely captured, thoroughly vetted, cleared of diseases, and deemed non-threatening to other animals in a controlled setting. It was a huge concession, a testament to the unusual nature of the story. The challenge now was the capture. Dr. Evans brought a large, comfortable pet carrier, advising Martha to leave it near the feeding station, door open, perhaps lined with a soft blanket that smelled faintly of her. The hope was that the animals would gradually accept it as part of the landscape, maybe even explore inside. For days, the carrier sat untouched. Ginger gave it a wide berth. Pip sniffed around it curiously but wouldn't venture in. The first real snow flurry dusted the mountains, a stark white warning time was running out. Then, one cold morning, Martha arrived to find Ginger cautiously sniffing inside the carrier. Encouraged, Martha placed the day's food, Pip's medicated banana, and Ginger's chicken right at the back of the carrier. After a long hesitation, hunger won out. Ginger slipped inside to eat. Pip, unwilling to be left out and perhaps feeling safer with Ginger already there, scrambled in after her, grabbing his banana. This was the moment. Moving slowly, heart pounding, Martha approached the carrier from behind and gently swung the door shut, securing the latch. Panic erupted inside. Pip shrieked and rattled the bars. Ginger yowled, throwing herself against the door. Martha felt a terrible pang of guilt, murmuring apologies. "It's okay. It's for the best," she whispered, though the distressed sounds tore at her. Dr. Evans, who had been waiting discreetly nearby, came quickly. Together, they carefully covered the carrier with a blanket to help calm the animals and carried it back to his waiting vehicle. The drive to the vet clinic was filled with anxious noises, but the darkness under the blanket eventually had a quieting effect. At the clinic, Dr. Evans expertly sedated both animals just enough to perform thorough health checks. Pip's leg injury, as suspected, was a badly healed fracture that would likely always cause a slight limp, but could be managed. Ginger, remarkably, was in good health despite her feral life, strong, well-nourished, thanks to Martha's supplements, and free of major parasites or diseases communicable to primates. The call to the sanctuary confirmed they would accept both animals, placing them in a special secluded enclosure initially to monitor their interaction and acclimatize them. The separation during the transport and initial quarantine was unavoidable, but would be kept as short as possible. Saying goodbye was harder than Martha could have imagined. She watched as Pip, groggy but calm, was placed in a secure transport crate, and Ginger, still sleepy, in another. She reached through the bars of Pip's crate, and to her surprise, he tentatively touched her finger with his own tiny one. She stroked Ginger's soft fur through the mesh of her carrier. "Be good to each other," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. Weeks later, Martha received a package from the sanctuary. Inside were photographs and a long letter. The photos showed Pip and Ginger in a large sunlit enclosure filled with climbing structures and natural foliage. One photo showed Ginger lounging on a warm rock while Pip groomed her fur nearby. Another showed them sharing a bowl of fruit. The letter detailed their successful integration. Ginger, while still wary of most humans, had claimed the enclosure as her territory and remained fiercely protective of Pip. Pip, thriving with proper nutrition, medical care, and the security of his feline companion, was becoming more confident and playful. They were, the director wrote, an unlikely but undeniable pair, fascinating staff and visitors alike. Martha framed one of the photos and placed it on the mantelpiece next to George's picture. The forest outside her window felt quieter now, the spot by the creek empty. But her heart was full. She hadn't just saved a lost monkey, she had witnessed and helped preserve a rare, beautiful connection. The orange cat and the baby monkey, brought together by chance and held together by an inexplicable bond, were safe. Their story, a quiet miracle nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, proved George right. Nature's capacity for kindness and connection often defied all expectations, a testament to the enduring power of empathy, even across the boundaries of species. And Martha knew she would carry the warmth of that unlikely friendship with her for the rest of her days.